Welcome to A World Gone Mad, where I'm your host, Christian McMillan. I am once again joined by Liev Dalton of Beyond Terrain. Liev is a terrain theorist, which maybe you could try to briefly summarize what that is for people who didn't hear our last discussion.
Terrain theory, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call it a theory. In a way, it's sort of just a framework. Um, because a theory is sort of this, we fight against the germ theory, but in a way, this germ theory is built upon the terrain theory. The terrain is everything, so our major claim, I guess, is that germs don't cause disease and that it's the terrain that is actually the cause of disease, even in so-called infectious illnesses. So it's sort of that underlying framework, because even if germs did cause disease, it would still be a part of the terrain theory. But that theory is built upon hypotheses which have been falsified. So that's why we reject the germ theory completely. But um, say there was a hypothesis saying, this toxin causes this disease, like radiation causes radiation poisoning. That's a hypothesis that you could test and prove that, Hiroshima caused a bunch of radiation sickness. So that sort of builds on this terrain idea that our environments, our external environments depict our internal environments. So that's sort of fundamentally what the terrain is. The terrain is everything. It sort of encompasses everything. People take a very holistic approach in the terrain field, right? It encompasses the mental aspect of things, the spiritual aspect, as well as the physical. We certainly don't reject the physical, but um, we know that there is a great interconnectedness there too. So, yeah, kind of moved away from terrain theory and sort of just the terrain paradigm is what people tend to call it now. Semantics.
Right. I do see why that's a better description, though.
Yeah.
So I had gone back, you had recommended your first handful of episodes because it really does tell the story of why people believe in this narrative of contagion being the source of illness. And I'm about halfway through. In the second part, I think it's the fall of the germ. I'm halfway through that, but you do a great job of really painting the narrative. I think narratives are everything in life. They help us tribalize, they help us find our people, they help us be inspired and know what direction we're looking to go in life and cultivate our identity. And I think I see really why this is something you pursue passionately with a mixture of discipline that is in the terrain paradigm itself. And something that fascinated me in the tale of the rise and fall of germ theory was the Flexner report. And I was wondering if you could break down what it is and what its effects were.
Yeah, the Flexner report really central sort of in the story of why everyone believes in contagion, or even in the story of modern medicine. Abraham Flexner wrote this Flexner report, and primarily he was associated with some heavy hitters, um, associated with sort of Andrew Carnegie, the Carnegie Foundation, as well as the Rockefellers. Um, and of course, the Rockefellers were in the oil industry, and the Carnegies were in the steel industry, and they had a pretty good rapport together because together they sort of built modern America in a way, at
Mm.
least provided the foundation for it. So the Flexner report came in early 1900s, and essentially standardized the curriculum in a way. It definitely indirectly influenced this curriculum, because it was assessing medical curriculums, the funding needed for proper medical school, but it centralized everything. So after the Flexner report, instead of having a bunch of different universities teaching all sorts of different medicines and all sorts of nonsense and pseudoscience, which there was quite a bit of it, no doubt about it,
Hmm.
and a centralized body, you could argue whether it's inherently bad or not. Um, in a way, it was a necessity for the modern world. Obviously, the centralized body now is not conducive to true knowledge or health. Um, But yeah, this report essentially said that all medical interventions need to be pharmaceutical. That was sort of the prevailing notion, the prevailing narrative of the text. And it sort of standardized the curriculum across the board. And so all the universities sort of hopped on these the same curriculum. So everybody was was teaching the same stuff. Everyone had
Hmm.
to teach the germ theory. Everyone had to teach all this stuff. So, and there are ties between the Louis Pasteur. There are ties between, the emperor in France, Emperor Napoleon III. There are ties with the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and it can go very deep, and it can go very deep. And um, you know, it was that centralization that was the most problematic part. It spoke a lot about money actually in the Flexner report,
Okay.
saying how a university needed a lot of money to operate. And so, the people with big money who are donating a lot of money as philanthropy, or you could call it tax write-offs in more
Yes.
realistic terms, because these philanthropic associations and donations certainly serve those that are donating. Um, but the Carnegies and the Rockefellers were pushing this curriculum. They were pushing this germ theory because obviously all the petrochemical drugs coming out, and um, they were the ones that were able to fund these universities. So the most important lesson I ever learned was when I was putting in some boat docks with my now wife's family,
Hmm.
um, and we were putting these docks in. And we had a farmer down there who was helping. He had a tractor and he was putting the docks in the water. Sorry, hit my mic there. And we had a fisherman in the water, and he was the one that were pulling the docks out and lining up the docks to send them out and putting the anchors down. And fishermen and farmers don't really like each other all that much. There's a little bit of feud there, so they were bickering back and forth. But the farmer pulled me aside and he was talking with my wife and I, and he was saying, you know, we can bicker all day about how things ought to be and who needs to do things what way and whatever it is. But at the end of the day, I'm going to listen to whoever's name is at the bottom of my check.
Yes.
And it was the most important story I ever learned. And it sums up all the problems in today's world. Who funds the literature? Who funds the research in science and modern science? Who funds the curriculums? Who implemented the curriculums? Who funded the implementation of standardized curriculum across universities, across the schools, right? Because, you know, the Rockefellers did that too. They standardized curriculums in every school, not just universities. That was another philanthropy act of his, right? Um, but whose name was on the bottom of that check is the question that you need to ask. So, yeah, the Flexion report, I'm probably missing some details. Honestly, I haven't really, it's kind of out of my mind nowadays, but
Yes.
um, yeah, I mean, integral part. Super interesting to read. You know, it's really interesting to read if you have the time. It's available on archives and everything. So I would recommend reading it.
I
Um,
will. I will.
yeah,
Because it
good.
just even you mentioning it in those early podcasts really did catch my attention because in the narrative, it clearly played a huge role. And it is, like you say, the financial incentives are there with the Rockefellers being of oil money, medications being an oil byproduct in many scenarios. And even it does kind of make me think about the fact that lots of narratives in medicine that come to medication are that it's very theoretical, the idea of chemical deficiencies and things like that, serotonin deficiency as example.
Definitely.
Something else I like that you said in those earlier episodes was that science and the truth within it should be available to everyone. And as somebody who pursues science and truth, you should be able to explain your ideas to a 5-year-old. And that is a beautiful notion, I think, in a world where today there's lots of deferring to experts, and I'll put experts in quotes, which experts are often people with those exact incentives that you are describing right now.
Yeah. you know, the appeal to expertise, um, it is not a logical way of thinking. Um, it falls under the appeal to authority. To base an argument completely on expertise is problematic in many ways because you're not actually addressing any sort of evidence whatsoever. That's the main problem. If you quote an expert who provides evidence, that's a more useful way to use it. It's less of an appeal to expertise. If you're appealing to the expertise evidence. But the problem is when you go down these rabbit holes, when you go down and you look at the evidence, there is no evidence. It's just nonsense. The evidence usually lies in the narratives that is told about objective data. So that's a huge problem in empiricism, which this is quite a topic we could probably delve into. Um, the problems with empiricism is that you have objective observations, but then you must induce a theory from it. This is the process of induction, and this is largely what science does nowadays because we've moved away from a true empirical objective empirical approach, which would be Popper's falsification. Um, so we have these observations and we make positive claims about these observations. So we see people get sick in close proximity, blah, blah, blah. I'm straw manning pretty hard here, but then we create this story that the little bugs, because we could see them under the microscope and people's snot, are the cause because they're present when people are sick, that these must be the cause. So they take this empirical observation, which is, microbes, more microbes in the snot of people who are sick. That's the objective observation that no one denies. But then the story, the narrative told about this objective observation, about the germ theory and immune systems and all this nonsense, is the unscientific part of it. So that's where you're moving away from what is true. So we have observations, and objective observations are important in science, which is why I suggest when you are going to read the scientific literature, you're going to read the method section and the results section. And realistically, you don't need an introduction and you don't need a discussion section. The data should speak for itself. I understand the format in the modern world. I understand the format and why it's important now. But the problem is that it becomes so subjective. The discussion is so subjective because it's based on your preconceived notions. So this is what Thomas Kuhn talks about. He wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, fantastic book. He talks about how in empiricism, it is impossible to induce any sort of theory objectively. It is completely based on your subjective understanding, your worldview, your preconceived notions. So it's always going to be biased when you're doing an induction like that. And in logic, deduction or induction is the weaker form of argumentation. You should always aim for a deduction, right? So I'll break that down real quick. A deduction, you're going from something broad and you're going more specific, right? So you're taking a broad idea and you're going to deduce something more specific. With induction, you're taking specific observations in science. You're taking a lot of different experiments and you're going to mash them all together and you're going to induce some sort of theory, some sort of broader theory to try and explain all the phenomenon that's occurring in these experiments. So deduction, you're going from broad to specific. Induction, you're going from specific to broad. You can kind of see why induction is weaker, right? Because you're not getting the whole picture from very specific observations. Now, induction is not useless, and scientific method is not useless, and empiricism is not useless. And that's where falsification comes into play. Falsification is really important, and it's forgotten. And Karl Popper is rolling over in his grave right now at the state of science.
Something went wrong. Please.
My phone is making noises here. Sorry.
No worries.
So when it comes to falsification, essentially what you're looking at is you run an experiment and you have a theory in your mind, You run an experiment to try and falsify that theory. So take the germ theory. All right, we think that, you know, there's some sort of contagion that occurs between people, because of microbes.
Hmm.
So let's get a group of people that are sick. Let's take 10 people that are sick and let's expose them to another 10 people that are perfectly healthy, that have never contracted the disease, and let's expose them to another 10 people who have contracted the disease previously. They all have the perfect symptom profile, and let's see if the healthy people get sick. So they did this actually. This is one of the first studies I ever read on the topic, and it was Gallup's Island. Um, Really important study. What they try to do is produce this disease. So they first had people breathe in close proximity, then they had people cough on each other, sneeze in the healthy people's mouths. They actually went so far as taking mucus out of the sick people, putting it indirectly, like through swabs, to the healthy people, couldn't produce disease. They actually ended up taking blood from the sick people, putting into healthy people, and couldn't produce disease. Zero people got sick. Zero healthy people got sick in this study. Now, contagion studies, there's over 200 of them in the literature. Not one of them has ever produced any sort of positive result indicating contagion. So this, in its truest sense, is a falsification of the germ theory. But for some reason, these studies are dismissed. And even though they're properly controlled scientific studies, they're dismissed because, our understanding of microbiology was so primitive. But they lost this, right? They lost this. They lost this true empiricism. Now they want to induce information. And so it's stories is the point I'm trying to make. We tell these stories about data. Data is data and it should just be itself and it should be objective and it should be interpreted objectively. As soon as it's interpreted, though, it becomes more subjective, right? Because it's based on your preconceived notions. And thinking back to your question, I hope that sort of answered it, maybe in some sort of roundabout way.
No,
Um,
absolutely. And okay, so what you make me think about, because the Gallops Island scenario is super fascinating, and you had talked about, oh, trying to remember his name, but he had principles. You didn't call them principles, you called
Hoax
them.
postulates.
Yes,
Hoax
that's
postulates.
exactly
Yeah.
what I'm talking about. Um, and one of the notions was it's important to observe things in their natural environments and how they naturally behave, right? And with these microbe studies, is it correct? Is my understanding correct in which the only times they're able to support the contagion theory is with adjuvants and manipulated bacterial culture and things like that, and they can only produce it under the microscope, which alters the principles of the study in every way, right?
You're bang on. You're bang on because, and this is it. So Koch's postulates is the set of postulates essentially um, that's used to prove the causal relationship between a microbe and a disease. Um, I don't have them memorized. Should at this point.
That
Let's read them out for the listeners.
sounds great. Because it is super
So we
fascinating and it makes a great deal of sense when you're searching for objective truth.
Absolutely. Okay, here they are. Koch's postulates. So a specific organism can always be found in association with a given disease. The organism, this is postulate 2. The organism can be isolated and grown in pure culture in the laboratory. Postulate 3. The pure culture will produce the disease when inoculated into a susceptible animal. And number 4, it is possible to recover the organism in a pure culture from the experimentally infected animal. Right? So that's not exactly what he wrote, but that's the gist.
Okay.
That's the gist. So Koch's postulates essentially is a perfect set of postulates. It makes a lot of sense. We need to take a sick person, we got to isolate out the bacteria, introduce it into a healthy person, and then re-isolate it to make sure it's the same bacteria. And that when it's introduced into the healthy person, it should cause illness.
Mm-hmm.
So Koch's postulates obviously have never been fulfilled for a huge number of reasons. And it's admitted completely in science. It's generally understood. These are outdated. That's what they love to say. It's outdated.
Right.
But these are perfectly logical postulates that follow each other well, that if conducted properly in a scientific experiment, would prove the causal relationship between bacteria and a disease or any organism, but obviously virus is a different story. What you're saying, adjuvants. Adjuvants are additives that they add to, the cupcakes that we get into our arms. And essentially, their use is to stimulate an immune response.
Right.
So this is it. They need to have adjuvants in cupcakes to stimulate an immune response. Without it, there is no immune response. You can have the part of a dead virus in there or part of a bacteria in there, or it doesn't matter. It will not produce disease. It will not produce an immune response. So they need to add an adjuvant. So with these Koch's postulate studies, there are a few studies out there where they try to introduce bacteria into an individual, but they introduce the bacteria individual into the individual with a heavy metal like mercury. And that's what
Right.
adjuvants are. Adjuvants are, they used to be mercury, now they're aluminum. So they have to add this heavy metal. And there's a lot more than just heavy metals in this. There's a ton of other things, and they're untested. There's no study out there that tests the safety of aluminum injections alone.
Right.
And you're getting into the problems with cupcake research here now. But there's no isolated introduction of the organism into a host. No one can take a bacteria or a fungus or a parasite and introduce it into a healthy person and cause disease. It's never happened and it never will happen. I would love for it to happen because then I would completely accept the germ theory. I would like it to be reproduced a few times, but that would be convincing. That would be very convincing, but it's never occurred. You cannot produce disease in an individual unless there's additives, right? And then you're moving away from the principles of scientific method, which is the isolation of variables. And so then you can't even draw an induction from that.
Well, and I do think it's clear to imagine that injecting heavy metals would have some sort of effect on your health that would make you seem, that would have a symptomatic effect, something that could be easily observed.
Yeah.
No, it's super fascinating. It was the first listening to your podcast that had painted the narrative so much more completely, the ad of adjuvants in the discussion, because I was wondering how on earth does anybody come to this conclusion at all, but with a total manipulation of the factors. And that's what everybody's had, one of those shots in their arm, and often you don't feel great afterwards. But I also, my day job, I work with lead and various heavy metals, and it's a thing that everybody all day long, you take a myriad of safety precautions, but nobody thinks twice before putting it directly in your body.
It's funny. They tell pregnant women not to eat seafood because of heavy metals.
No, that's
They go
one
and
that
inject the
I've been
kid.
there. It blows my mind. It blows my mind. Don't worry
It
about the
makes no
mercury
sense.
you're putting
And this
directly inside you.
There's a
But
ton of studies that show that seafood consumption in like mothers who are expecting increases like the IQ of children and makes healthier outcomes in the babies and pregnancies. It's like it's so absurd. There's no transparency, and this is what the question was before. There's no transparency in these studies. So when they do these, cupcake studies, the control group, so they have two groups essentially. They have one group where they have the regular cupcake. They have the microbe in it and they have all of the ingredients.
okay.
And the control group for safety studies is the exact same cupcake, but with no microbes in it. So both groups have aluminum in it.
Okay.
So you're testing aluminum versus aluminum. And then, so say there's 100,000 people in this study, which is a huge study. Doesn't really happen in these kind of clinical trials. But say that you had 100,000 people and 5,000 in each group had adverse effects. They will say, oh, both groups had the same number of adverse effects, so they must be safe because the
Right.
control group is the same results as the experimental group. That is 100% what all of these studies do. That is the control that they use in cupcake research. It's absurd. It's completely unscientific. And there is no study that tests the safety of aluminum versus a saline injection. You know
Right.
what I mean? There's not, that's a valid control. A saline
Mhm.
shot would be a valid control. But then in the experimental group, you'd have 5,000 people with adverse effects, and in the control, you'd have zero. So, how could you possibly like write a discussion on that? So this is it. People go and they read the discussion of papers, or they read the abstract, which is absurd. But sometimes they'll skip right to the discussion because they think, oh, the methodology must be good. The results are whatever. I want to read what the scientists have to say about the results. They go
Yes.
to the results and they see, you know, same amount of adverse reactions were in the control and the experimental group. Therefore, they are safe. It's like, all right, there we go. That's why people believe this stuff, because they don't look at the methods and they don't assess the methods or the results objectively. They skip the method section. I was guilty. I was guilty for this when I was in school. I've never read a method section in my life. You
That
just
was
trust that the
actually
methods are good.
it had started to change my opinions of various things in the world when I started realizing that there's different people who work in sciences who put a big emphasis on the methods. Like I like people like Andrew Huberman's a great example, or I really like a podcast called More Plates, More Dates, and it revolves mostly around sports sciences and stuff like that. But what intrigued me about those shows initially years ago was the fact that they take the study and they look at the methods and they explain why some are more valid than others. And most importantly, I love meta analysis. I love when people look across the data broadly and see what the greater implications are. And then it comes down to sometimes people there's this defiance to the concept of faith when people analyze science or think of themselves as scientifically enlightened. And it's so funny to me because I feel like you see so much blind faith in science that it might as well be a religion a great deal of the time.
100%. I will say, look, I will comment on the religion, on the analogy there. But I will say with meta-analysis, you got to be careful
Okay.
because unless, it depends on the field. It depends on the field. Um, but meta-analyses can be even more misleading because you're one step further removed from the actual experiments themselves. So then it's like oftentimes in meta-analysis, when you go and you read the papers that are being cited in the meta-analysis, you're like, wow, this is nothing that they're talking about in the meta-analysis. Where the hell is this meta-analysis getting all this information from?
Okay.
So it's really good to delve in. Like, that's my favorite thing to do in a paper. Go to any paper, find a citation, and follow it back and keep following it back until you're like, there's never been an experiment to prove this whatsoever. Usually they're citing introductions, they're citing abstracts, they're citing, you really should only be citing the results section. A lot of people cite the discussion section. You can see how the narratives tend to snowball if you're just citing people's stories or interpretations of data. Um, but that's it. It is, and to comment on the religion thing, modern science is the newest and most popular religion. There's no way around that. It's completely faith-based is why you have slogans like trust the experts.
Yes, exactly.
It's nonsense. There should be no trust in science. There should be data. There should be objectivity, So it's like trust and faith in science is counterintuitive to what science actually is. It goes against what science is.
It should come down to the
So
proof.
it should always be the proof, man. It's the evidence. There should be evidence. There needs to be evidence. Experiments need to be conducted over and over and over again and produce similar results, at least similar
At
results,
least.
if not the same. That doesn't happen because there's no budget anymore in science for true science. Um, there's no budget. There's no budget to reproduce literature. There's something in the literature that's well known, that's admitted by so many. Like, I mean, it's not even something that's debatable. It's called the reproducibility crisis. Most of the scientific literature is not reproducible, and reproducibility is the cornerstone of science. You should be able to conduct the same experiments. That's the purpose of method sections, so that other people can reproduce your experiment and see if they get the same results. Because if it's a good experiment, it should yield the same results over and over and over again. It's like 90% of psychology research is not reproducible.
I have heard that
And in the
before.
what?
I've heard that before. I had listened to a podcast on somebody who had written a book on the subject that the vast majority of psychology is fad notions.
It's not science. It's not scientific. It's not, and that's not to say that the study of psychology is not good. I
Hmm.
love psychology. I study psychology formally at school right now. I'm doing my master's in it. But the study is not scientific. I believe that psychology is not an empirical endeavor. It should be completely taken from a rationalism standpoint. It should be completely logic based.
Right.
Empiricism just cannot prove any sort of psychological phenomenon. It's the same as economics. Economics should not be empirical. And I think I mean, unless you're taking a purely falsification standpoint, even the natural sciences, empiricism fails time and time again. And the reproducibility crisis is not just the psychology field. Biomedical research is the second leading field in which there is a reproducibility crisis. And this is largely due to antibodies. Antibodies are non-specific, but they're treated as being specific. And so the
Okay.
results are just terrible. Um, and there are companies and organizations out there to try to improve the specificity of antibodies. And it's just sometimes it depends on how you set up the study, right? The methods are important. You could set up a study so that the antibodies look specific, and you could set it up with controls, and so you'll understand that they're not specific. So but in antibody research, usually there's no controls, which is a huge problem. It's a terrible problem.
Hmm. It's all very interesting. It's a lot to take in. And I got to
A lot.
say, upon meeting you and starting and seeing your content, because I had gotten lots of these notions right down to the scientism, what's actually objective, the pursuit of truth is the most shining beacon in your work and content. It just it had me thinking after our last discussion about why I had an interest in podcasting at all, which if I was to put it in one sentence, I think is getting to know the world a little more profoundly. And you bring about something that I love to do in my own life, which is I love challenging something I believe, a preconceived notion I have. And because the amount of times I've been amazed in my life at how my opinion alters is countless.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, man. That's what true science is too. You know, it's about challenging your own beliefs. I went through it pretty bad. Like I was fully on the other side of this argument at school. And I really took it upon myself to challenge these beliefs. And with a sliver of objectivity, you'll see that most of the modern scientific theories have no objective basis in reality. You know, there are objective observations that are made, like things that fall down.
Yes.
Things that fall down, they always fall down. You start talking about the way that the waves and the fabric of reality and gravity and all that nonsense theories, that maybe, but it's a model. It's an induction. It's not our reality. It's a way that we can try to understand it and explain it to ourselves, to try and make us feel as though we understand something about this realm. The reality is that it's very, very difficult to understand things about this reality. It is.
Mhm.
It's very difficult. It's the most challenging thing that you can do. It's been the question of our human existence since we've been able to perceive things whenever that began. You know, Trying to understand something is the fundamental question. And with modern science, it seems like you have all the answers in a similar way as the Bible gives you all the answers, or the Quran, or the Torah, or Buddhism, or Taoism. They give you answers. that you want. You want to feel like you know something. And that's why modern science is a religion. Because I'm not saying that these theories are incorrect of the fabric of reality, like that's what gravity is. It's because the gravitational pull of the mass of the earth, whatever. I'm not going to sit here and say it's wrong because I haven't looked into it
Right.
extensively enough.
Right.
But I do know that it's a model and it's an abstraction and it's based on a theory. And there's difference between the law of gravity. This is the law of gravity, and the theory of gravity, which is that we have these fabric in which the weight pulls down, and you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah,
for
energy
those
and
watching the
mass
video, I
work
was doing some
together.
gestures, but you know what I mean. Like, there's a huge difference in a law. A law is an observation that is 100% true all the time.
Right.
I would say like the terrain is the law. I would say a law is the terrain is everything. The terrain depicts your health and wellness. It depicts your disease. It depicts everything. Because we're beings, we live in environments. You live in an environment. That environment affects you. Like, you could think about it in so many different ways.
That,
But
and
it's
I perceive a humility in the concept of terrain because you have to admit that it's so vast that it's very difficult to understand. It's hard to get specific within and determine what notions actually mean what.
you know, science has lost humility. It really has. And there's many reasons, right? There's status, there's money, there's thinking that you know it more than other people, you know,
Hubris.
winning prizes, getting grants, getting tenure as a professor, the status of being a professor, the status of having your PhD, the status of being a doctor, the status of being a scientist, the status of being a frontline worker and being praised during the pandemic. There's a lot of incentive to be to 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 pretend that you know a lot, so and it's tough. It's a tough, lesson to learn. I was humbled. I'm not going to say that I'm humble. That's like the least humble thing you can do. But I was humbled. I was humbled when I started looking at things objectively. I think that's okay to say because I thought I knew everything and I realized that I don't know shit.
Yeah.
And go study any great scientist. Albert Einstein said it. He said, the more I understand about science, the more I understand that I don't know anything. That's paraphrase, but he said exactly
Yes.
like that idea. You know what I mean? So if you think he's a great scientist, he didn't know anything. So then you got Neil deGrasse Tyson rolling around saying that he knows everything. It's absurd, man. He's the most egomaniac I've ever met.
He is.
I
He's
didn't meet him, but
bombastic as hell, like just as a broad observation of his work. And I've read some of his books. I enjoy his work, but he sometimes is hard to digest as a personality.
it's terrible. I can't listen to him. Like, it's condescending every time he opens
Yes.
his mouth. It's terrible. That's not what science is. Like, that's not what science is at all. We've lost what science truly is. And I'll say I think it's due to there's a few reasons. Obviously, there's a ton of reasons. I think it's largely due to the separation of science from the field of philosophy,
Okay.
from spirituality. We've separated, we consider, the spiritual realm unscientific, because we've narrowed the scientific perspective to the scientific method. And obviously the scientific method can't um, understand that sort of phenomenon. Um, yeah, not that religion, I guess the study of theology, religion, or spirituality isn't a scientific endeavor according to the definitions nowadays, right? So it's not. But in its truest understanding, science, the study of nature, you should not you should not separate sort of the underlying fabric of reality, the energy of reality, like what occurs beyond
Hmm.
our limited senses. There should be no reason that's separated. And science is materialistic. And we've lost the philosophy aspect, which we've lost the epistemological aspect. We don't study knowing anymore. We don't study empiricism anymore. Scientists, no mention of empiricism. we brushed over Karl Popper in probably an introductory lecture in one of my university classes, and we didn't learn about falsification, or if we did, we learned about some sort of bastardized version that science claims to use, but really science doesn't use falsification at all, at all.
What you're making me think of, what comes to mind is the alchemical tradition, but also Taoism. And because you're kind of referring to holistic things, there's an element of ineffability. You can't really speak it. And that's what the Tao Te Ching has a passage in it that reads, the way that could be spoken is not the true way. And I do think there is this element of to life that we're not supposed to understand. And when people claim they do, it's the greatest beacon of hubris and something to really be careful of.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it is. I feel like you can kind of get to know it, but on only on like a personal level. You know what I mean? Like we can understand things about the material realm. I think it's really difficult. I think you can learn a lot about spirituality, but I don't think it's meant to be pushed on to others or formalized or standardized in any sort of way. I think it's your relationship with the realm. You can sort of understand your own. I think that's where the subjectivism sort of comes in. I'm not a subjectivist. I do think I, I don't know. I think about that stuff every now and again, and not I don't know what to say about it. But um, there certainly is this sort of underlying force to reality that you can't know
Mhm.
from a objective level in a way. It's it's like a paradox. Like you can know it, but you can't.
Mhm.
We could talk about it, but you can't talk about it. And so I actually really love alchemy. I love the study of alchemy because I think that they hit the nail on the head with this understanding. And I think they play it. There's a great interconnectedness in the alchemical tradition. I think alchemy obviously formed the basis of chemistry and probably partly the scientific method. I think if you're going to approach the truth, you need to study alchemy. And it like I know alchemy is like touted as like the biggest pseudoscience out there. Like, but if you think that they're actually talking about turning lead into gold, you've missed the plot. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? So
Yeah.
alchemy is a great subject that I've learned about a little bit. Need to learn more. There's a lot out there on it.
Yeah, it's been a reoccurring endeavor in my life. Every now and then I find myself going back to certain spiritual interest, but years ago I had read some of what they say was the works of Hermes Trismegistus. And that is also when you talk about knowing the world more profoundly, as above, so below comes to mind, and that you have to go within or you'll go without. It is, in a way, getting to know the world better is getting to know yourself better. And through that process, that is the connection I think you develop to the unspeakable, to the unknowable.
Absolutely. The Hermetic principles are, I think they're laws, man. You can't deny them. I don't think you can deny them. And that's the thing. Can you test them scientifically using the scientific method?
Yeah, not at all.
Not really. But I think that's where empiricism fails. I think that's where rationalism is more important. And I do want to note, I think religious texts, like I think even the Bible, the Quran, like even the Torah, whatever,
Mhm.
religious texts are a great place to start to read and to try and understand things because they're great texts.
Mhm.
They're some of the best texts ever written. That's why they're so popular because they give people what they want. Now, is there an objective interpretation of all these texts? I don't know. I don't know. You know, Maybe you just need to take them as they are and not interpret them and just read the words. And, you know, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to live as good of a life as we possibly can. I think if you're aligned with God, you're aligned with what is good.
Mhm.
Um, that's most people's goals. There's probably a few people out there that are not. aligned with God and want to walk with the devil. But I believe most people are good, and I think even if they're not, there's no reason to think that.
No, I agree. I agree. And that's what I've always been fascinated with the notion of humanism, that there's a degree to which every person knows right and wrong inherently. And I think that is where lots of biblical or other religious tales speak to people so profoundly. And what always
Mm.
comes to mind when I think of humanism, the first thing that crosses my mind is always Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And the fact that, the main character is so burdened with guilt that the actual salvation he finds is in the truth and in suffering consequences for his crime.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah,
there's something super
absolutely.
beautiful there.
Absolutely. And this is as above, so below. You can get, there's a lot of text out there, and there's been a lot of amazing people who have written some amazing things. And this is where I think that, there is some sort of objective truth beneath it all. And there's just subjective ways to interpret it, and there's subjective ways to discuss it and write about it. You know, you can get to this fundamental truth in so many different ways. There's not one way to get there. There's an infinite number of ways to get there. And there are different books you could read. A lot of people don't even need to read books to get this, understand this fundamental truth. A
Absolutely.
lot of people don't need to, they could live with the wolves and probably get it. I think as long as you're aligned with what is good, and you're, shooting for the stars, you're shooting for, better, you're probably going to get there. It's everyone's on a different journey. Everyone's on a different path. None are better or worse than others. We're all learning lessons. We're all, I don't know, man. It's like, you know, judging other people's paths. You may not agree with it. There's a lot of people I disagree with. And I wouldn't mind saying something to them, but what's the point? What's the
Mhm.
point? You're never gonna change their mind. And who the hell am I? You know?
I do. I also do find sometimes disagreements are where I really do think that lead turns into gold. Like when you hear two
Yeah,
oppositional stances on something, or even just a good, well intentioned argument has been one of the most fulfilling things in my life at times, to be honest.
absolutely. Disagreement is fundamental in science too, which is lost. Hans-Hermann Hoppa discusses argumentation as the fundamental starting point of philosophy. And it's an irrefutable claim, and it's a starting point. Because listen, if I say argumentation is the fundamental starting point of philosophy, and your answer is no, it's not, you just started an argument.
Yes.
So, you know what I mean? Like, how do you can't disagree with that. And if you're interested in, Hans-Hermann Hoppa is phenomenal. I'll send it to you after. I'll send
Sounds
you a good
good.
lecture, because like he really helped me in understanding the flaws in empiricism, you know, and really, if you can understand this, you'll understand all the problems in science. And I think it gives a lot of good insight into reality. But yeah, argumentation, man, is a good thing. It's a good
Hmm.
thing. And but peaceful argumentation, because non-peaceful argumentation again is goes against fundamental principles of our being. And Hoppe proves that as well, logically through
Hmm.
rationalism. He's phenomenal. Um, I love, man, arguing with people has been probably some of the best things that I've done in advancing my knowledge.
Hmm.
Listening to the other side, listening to the opposite side. I'll learn more from listening to an hour of Neil deGrasse Tyson speaking than I will listening to Andrew Kaufman.
Hmm.
And I think Dr. Andrew Kaufman is the best scientist on the planet. I love the guy.
Hmm.
And I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is the worst. And I have strong feelings about him. But, listening to him speak, my mind's going and I'm fired up and I'm like, oh, this is what I would say. This is why you're wrong. This is a logical
Absolutely.
fallacy. This is blah, blah, blah. right? Listening to the opposing point of view is the most important thing that you can do. It's
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally the most important thing that you can do. If you want to, like, that's why a lot of people are like anti-university. I think if you're really interested in science, go get a science degree.
Mm-hmm.
Go learn exactly the opposite of what you want to learn about, like about the truth. That you'll be able to break it down as long as you go into it with a strong understanding. A lot of people are naive going to school, and then you got to kind of unlearn things. But if you understand the terrain and you're like in high school or something, I'd say go for it. If you love it, if you love the terrain and you want to learn bioterrain medicine and you want to be a terrain doctor, whatever, go to school, learn about the other side. Christ, go to med school. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Understand that argument so you can dismantle it completely. And you'll be an expert. That's how you become an expert in this day and age because everyone around us understand they speak in the way of the modern scientists.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to use their terms. You have to use the terms of the modern science. You need to use their terms or else people won't understand you. That's the language right now. And if you want to dismantle something, you got to know it inside and out. That's like
Shake up,
fundamental in debate, right?
yeah, shaking up the establishment from within it.
Yeah, that's good too. That's a good idea.
And it's even like much like Aristotle's notion of speaking as others speak for the purposes of communication, though you can think and write as yourself entirely, but to a degree, you have to accommodate to be able to make a healthy mark in the world.
Yeah, it's rhetoric. You got to use
Mm-hmm.
the rhetoric. You got
Yes,
to appeal to the people. That's what it is. In a true scientific discussion, you shouldn't be engaged in rhetoric whatsoever, but that's
no.
what it is. The scientific papers are fundamentally rhetoric based. The discussion section is a rhetoric. It is the purpose of it. This is what I was taught in my writing for the sciences course at university. I was taught that the discussion section is the interpretation of the results. And in this interpretation of the results, you should provide other interpretations that would also fit the data because there's so many ways to interpret data. There's not just one, there's an infinite amount of ways to determine data. But in your discussion, you need to argue why your interpretation is the best one and why the other ones are not good. Now, not many discussion sections do that, but that's truly what the IMRAD function, the structure of scientific papers, that's part of the purpose of it. That's part of the purpose of the discussion, which doesn't occur anymore. It's just bad science on every level, from the experiment, from the funding, all the way to the iteration and the writing of the paper. So, it's terrible.
Truly, truly. It's super fascinating and it's awesome I really enjoy these discussions. Like this has been illuminating and to a degree you've challenged notions that I thought I had, that I thought I firmly believe in, as well as you have a lot of similar interests to myself in terms of getting to know the world more deeply.
Yeah, man, I can hear that too. And like, this is what I've always loved. It's what me and all the boys would talk about. When you're a kid, you think you know everything. And man, maybe I still think I know everything. I don't know. I try not to, but I at least try to question everything I think now because it's so important. If you're really concerned with the truth, you just need to question everything. Be curious. Always stay curious. Have some sort of childlike behavior in a way. And
Absolutely.
just think, man. But like, question yourself always as hard as you can. Be as hard on yourself, not like cognitively, like don't be like you're an idiot all the time, but you know, really you need to be diligent in dismantling your beliefs. And if
Mhm.
it's the truth, it will hold up to any sort of scrutiny that it faces.
I think that's the most important thing about yourself and how you came to your conclusions is the fact of you came to believe in the terrain paradigm through trying to disprove it and looking into what you thought was the absurdity of it.
100%. Yeah. Every day I tried to prove the germ theory right, and I tried to disprove the terrain theory. At the time, I thought it was a theory. It's not a theory. It's a paradigm. It's a framework. It's like a philosophy in a way. But I tried every day. You know what I mean? Like every day I tried to prove the germ theory right. And in doing that, and when you look at the evidence, you just realize, boom, it's not there.
Well, and that takes humility, right? That does take a degree of being humble to admit that you're wrong. And I love it. I love doing that myself.
Good, man. If you can get comfortable feeling like you don't know things or that like you're comfortable in the unknown. You're comfortable in the chaos. I know you're a Jordan Peterson fan. Like that's dude, I learned a lot from that guy, man, because that's what it's all about too. Not knowing is scary as shit.
Mhm.
And it's uncomfortable, to sit here and say like I don't know about these things that modern science explains. To say I don't know is a scary thing, but it doesn't really matter. You don't need to think about it. You don't need to think about any of this shit to be happy and to thrive and to live prosperously and have a nice family. You just live.
Yeah, it comes down to values and walking your talk, I think.
Definitely.
On
Definitely.
the sentiment of walking your talk, I gotta say, I saw a clip you posted and you eat a parasite out of a cod. And I got a strong stomach. Not things don't often shock me, but that shocked me.
Yeah, I think it got taken down.
Really? Oh, that was what. But it was just such proof of how much you believe in what in your sentiments on parasites and how they play a role in the terrain, that they won't thrive inside you if you're a healthy person, that it's your terrain that would cultivate a habitable environment for them. And there's no better proof that you believe that than when you ate a raw parasite out of a raw fish.
Yeah. And I was fine. I did it right before my wedding too. Yeah, it was kind of bold. Um, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately is walking the walk. I think like with all this social media stuff, man, like Instagram, I don't like Instagram. I don't like posting. I don't like making short form content. And I'm like, man, do I just hang it up? Do I like I might take a different approach to Instagram moving forward because I'm really trying to ever since that video, man, I've been thinking, I'm like, man, I'm really trying to walk the walk here. Like I love long form content. I think that's where
Yeah.
it's at. Like that's kind of where I want to stick. But the Instagram stuff, it's good. It's polarized. You can grow, go viral, get fat, get like huge really quickly. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the purpose that it serves me other than like being known. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I don't really care about being known. Like I'd much rather your name always it'll die eventually, but hopefully something that you do will stick around.
Mhm.
I'm more worried about that than some sort of name. If I can help people understand this terrain paradigm, that's that would be really cool. That's kind of what I'm all about. And it's tough. And Instagram, you get 3 minutes now. Nobody watches the 3 minute videos. People only watch the videos that are 30 seconds long. And
It's
you can't
true.
teach anybody shit in 30 seconds. You know what I mean? So it's kind of tough. But yeah, I've been thinking that a lot lately. But yeah, the parasite, that was fine. Ate a lot of raw fish recently, like fresh caught. It's so
Yeah.
good, man. Like PEI, it's delicious, man. I wouldn't, you know, would I eat that cod that had a bunch of parasites in it? Like I wouldn't because I do think that parasites concentrate heavy metals, and obviously
Yeah.
fish are full of heavy metals. And that's interesting. Like it's really interesting because the worms are always in the belly of the fish.
Okay.
They're always in the belly. And if you think about it, you think about the law of gravity, right? The fish is always upright. If the fish goes sideways, it dies. It's always upright. All the heavy metals, which are the heaviest, are always sink to the bottom, to the stomach of the fish.
Right.
So anytime I eat fish, I always cut the belly out anyways. Like I don't like to eat the bottom thin part of the fish because I think that's where all the heavy metals collect. I don't have an empirical paper to provide that, but it just makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But would I eat an old codfish like that, raw, like fresh? I mean, you'd be fine, especially if you're eating from like the back, from the top part of the fish, if you ate a lot of it. I mean, but if there's a lot of heavy metals and if it's an old fish, I don't know, man. Like, it's probably fine. Agenus did some interesting experiments with fish where he'd feed cats, I think, raw fish versus cooked fish. And when it
Okay.
was raw, you absorbed like no heavy metals. But when it was cooked, you absorbed like 9 or 10 times the amount of heavy metals. Like when it was
Really?
raw, you didn't absorb shit from them. So even you're probably fine to eat parasites and not absorb any of the heavy metals because it's raw. But I mean, it's gross. Eating worms is
Yeah.
disgusting.
Yeah,
Who
no,
the
that
hell
was
wants to
what
do that?
that's not a lot grosses me out, man, but that did. I cringed a little. But I did. I respected it at the same time. I was like, that's brave.
Appreciate it, brother.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. Thanks a lot for being here, dude. Very glad
Always,
to
dude. I
know
love our
you.
chats.
Yeah, this has been great.